We've all heard the phrase silence speaks louder than words. But what if I told you that silence, in the wrong hands, doesn't just speak, it destroys. It isolates. It manipulates. It dominates. Silence, when used with intention, becomes one of the most powerful psychological weapons ever created. And unlike shouting or violence, it leaves no visible scars. Yet its impact can echo for years, sometimes forever. In this journey, we will dive deep into the haunting psychology of those who use silence not as a path to peace, but as a means of control. And by the end, you will never look at silence the same way again. You are about to step into a place few dare to go, a place beyond words, a terrain where emotional warfare is fought not through what is said, but through what is withheld. This isn't about ordinary quiet. This is about strategic silence, intentional, calculated, often cloaked in righteousness or disguised as reflection. You are about to understand the minds of those who wield silence like a knife, cutting through connection, empathy, and trust. And if you've ever been on the receiving end of it, you know how deeply it wounds. Let's start with a truth that's hard to swallow. Silence is not always peaceful. Many people believe that silence is inherently spiritual, virtuous, or healing. But like any tool, its morality lies in its intention. A knife can prepare a meal or take a life. Likewise, silence can bring clarity or it can bring chaos. The philosopher Blaise Pascal once said, "All of humanity's problems stem from man's inability to sit quietly in a room alone." But what happens when someone uses that same quiet not to find peace, but to punish? People who use silence as a weapon understand psychology far more than they let on. They know that humans are wired for connection, that being ignored, dismissed, or emotionally abandoned triggers the same part of the brain as physical pain. Silence, in this context, becomes a form of emotional starvation. It's not just the absence of words, it's the withholding of recognition, of presence, of existence. When someone turns silent on you, especially after conflict or vulnerability, they are not just quiet. They are communicating something very loud. You are not worthy of my attention. This is where the first psychological layer reveals itself. Strategic silence is often rooted in power dynamics. The one who withdraws controls the emotional temperature. The one left behind is forced into a state of uncertainty, anxiety, and self-blame. We begin to question ourselves. What did I do wrong? Why won't they talk to me? Could I have said something differently? And in that confusion, we become malleable. Silence becomes a form of psychological conditioning. It teaches us, speak carefully, or you'll lose me. Over time, we begin to self-censor, to tiptoe, to submit not to love, but to fear. The second layer is more insidious. Silence can be used to rewrite reality. When someone refuses to acknowledge a conversation, an event, or even your feelings, they erase it. They create a void where clarity should be. This is emotional gaslighting without ever saying a word. You begin to doubt not just what happened, but whether it happened at all. You feel invisible, unanchored, and emotionally adrift. And the person who controls the silence now controls your sense of truth.
Click subscribe to this channel to get more profound insights.
Have you ever had someone go silent on you after you expressed hurt or vulnerability? Not yell, not argue, just disappear. That's not emotional maturity. That's emotional warfare. It's a way of saying, your pain is not valid. Your words are not worth my response. And the deeper tragedy is that most people who do this don't even recognize it as abuse. They call it boundaries. They call it space. But in truth, it's punishment. It's control. It's power disguised as detachment. Lao Tzu once said, Silence is a source of great strength, and it can be, but in the wrong hands, it becomes a weapon of suppression. In intimate relationships, silence can be used to avoid accountability. Rather than face difficult conversations, one partner retreats into a wall of coldness. This forces the other to either chase, apologize, or give up. Silence becomes the ultimate form of avoidance. No argument, no resolution, just a void that keeps the power in the hands of the one who refuses to speak. But let's be honest, we've all used silence this way at some point. Maybe not intentionally, maybe not maliciously. But when we're hurt, overwhelmed, or afraid, it's easier to shut down than to speak up. And yet, when silence becomes a repeated pattern, it stops being self-protection and starts being emotional manipulation. There's a difference between taking space and creating distance, between needing quiet and using quiet to punish. The intention makes all the difference. So ask yourself this: when you go silent, what are you really trying to achieve? Are you creating space for clarity? Or are you trying to control the other person's emotions? Are you withdrawing to reflect? Or are you retreating to punish? These are not easy questions, but they are necessary ones. Because silence, when used unconsciously, can become a poison that slowly corrodes the foundation of every relationship it touches. The philosopher Epictetus said, "We have 2 ears and 1 mouth so that we can listen twice as much as we speak." But even listening requires presence. It requires engagement. It requires response. Silence can be noble when it comes from wisdom, but it becomes cruel when it comes from fear, pride, or the need to dominate. Let's explore the deeper psychological roots behind this behavior. Why do some people use silence as a weapon in the first place? Often it stems from early experiences of powerlessness. As children, when we had no control over our environment, silence may have been our only defense. We learned to shut down to protect ourselves, to go numb, to withdraw. And as adults, we unconsciously carried this behavior into our relationships. But now, instead of being a defense, it becomes a form of offense. We silence others before they can hurt us. We disappear before we can be abandoned. We punish before we can be punished. This is survival masquerading as strength. But true strength is not the ability to withhold love, presence, or words. True strength is the ability to engage with compassion, even in discomfort, to speak truth, even when it's inconvenient, to show up even when we'd rather run. Silence may feel like control, but it often reflects fear of confrontation, fear of vulnerability, fear of being seen in our rawest form. And what about the one on the receiving end? The one who waits, who wonders, who feels the cold sting of invisibility? If you've ever been there, you know how it feels like your entire nervous system is suspended in time. You replay every word. You question your worth. You beg for closure. But silence offers none. And in that absence, a cruel truth emerges. Silence doesn't just withhold words, it withholds humanity. It says, "You do not exist to me right now." Can you imagine a more painful message? But here's the awakening. You are never truly defined by someone else's silence. Their refusal to engage, to respond, to acknowledge says more about their emotional capacity than your worth. You don't have to beg for voice. You don't have to plead for presence. You can choose to rise from that silence with your own voice intact. And that is the beginning of reclaiming power, not through domination, not through retaliation, but through radical self-respect. Silence becomes less dangerous when we meet it with clarity. When someone goes silent, we can step into awareness rather than anxiety. We can ask ourselves, Is this silence coming from a place of reflection or control? Is it creating space for resolution or tension for manipulation? When we name the silence, we take away its power, because silence only controls us when we fear it. When we see through it, it loses its grip. In spiritual traditions, silence is often revered. Monks take vows of silence to deepen their connection to the divine. Mystics retreat into silence to hear the voice of the soul. But notice the difference. This silence is inward. It is not used to punish. It is used to understand. That is the kind of silence that heals, the kind that rebuilds, the kind that nurtures. So we must ask, what kind of silence are we practicing? Is it the silence of fear or the silence of wisdom? Is it the silence that deepens division or the silence that invites unity? And more importantly, in moments where silence could be used as a weapon, can we choose instead to speak with love, with honesty, with courage? Because the world doesn't need more silence. It needs more truth. And sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is to break the silence not with anger, but with presence. Not with noise, but with clarity. Not with blame, but with heart. Let us go deeper into the shadows of silent warfare. If in the first half we explored the mechanics, now we must explore the consequences on the mind, on the soul, on the invisible threads that bind us to others. Silence, when used as manipulation, doesn't just alter the relationship. It alters your sense of reality. It splits you from yourself. You start to hear voices in your own head where their voice should have been. You begin to narrate both sides of the conversation, trying to resolve something that was never allowed to begin. This is why prolonged silence can feel like emotional exile. It doesn't just say, "I'm angry." It says, "You don't exist." And the longer it continues, the more it erodes the emotional structure that relationships are built on: trust, safety, reciprocity. Deep down, we all fear disappearing. We fear not mattering. And strategic silence plays directly into that primal fear. It doesn't need to scream. It just needs to withhold. And in that withholding, it forces the other person to collapse inward, to shrink, to disappear emotionally so the silence can dominate the space. And yet, many people who use silence this way genuinely believe they are being mature. They believe they are avoiding conflict, preserving peace, or taking time to reflect. And sometimes, that's true. Silence used for reflection is powerful. But reflection requires return. It requires re-engagement. If silence becomes a permanent wall, it's no longer about peace, it's about power. And here lies the tragedy. People who use silence as a weapon rarely see themselves as aggressors. They see themselves as misunderstood, as calm, as controlled. But control without communication is not maturity. It's suppression. Nietzsche once wrote, "All great things must first wear terrifying and monstrous masks in order to inscribe themselves on the hearts of humanity." And silence, when weaponized, wears one of the most terrifying masks of all: indifference. Indifference is not the opposite of hate, it's the denial of existence. When someone meets your vulnerability with silence, they are not just refusing to connect. They are refusing to acknowledge your humanity. And that is a wound deeper than words can describe. So what can we do? How do we defend ourselves not with armor, but with awareness? First, we must stop internalizing the silence. We must stop making it about our unworthiness. When someone withdraws, it's not always a reflection of your failure. Often, it's a reflection of their emotional limitation. Silence is easier than dialogue for those who fear confrontation, who lack emotional vocabulary, or who were never taught how to process feelings in a healthy way. But we must stop romanticizing emotional unavailability. We must stop calling silence strength when it's really avoidance, because avoidance creates trauma, not always through what is done but through what is not done. Second, we must strengthen our relationship with our own voice. When someone's silence threatens to drown you, you must speak anyway. Not to them necessarily, but to yourself, to a journal, to a therapist, to a friend. Your voice must not be silenced just because theirs has retreated. Speak your truth even when no one is listening, because the act of speaking is not always for them. Sometimes it's for you, to remind yourself that you are still here, that you still exist, that you still matter. Third, we must normalize emotional accountability. Silence is often used to avoid the discomfort of responsibility. It's easier to disappear than to admit fault, easier to ghost than to grow. But relationships, real ones, require repair. They require the willingness to return after rupture. To say, "I was hurt," or "I hurt you." Silence may feel safer, but it creates emotional debt. And that debt accumulates until the relationship collapses under its weight. So we must begin to hold ourselves and others to the sacred standard of return. Not perfection, not constant harmony, but return. Ask yourself this: when was the last time you went silent on someone, not out of self-care, but out of fear or pride? And when was the last time someone's silence made you question your entire value? These are not small moments. These are profound turning points in our emotional lives, because silence, when repeated, becomes a script that defines how we show up in every relationship moving forward, unless we rewrite it. We must also learn to differentiate between healthy solitude and harmful silence. Solitude is chosen. It's empowering. It connects us to ourselves. But harmful silence is imposed. It disconnects us from others. The difference lies in intention and outcome. Solitude heals. Weaponized silence harms. And if we don't learn to tell the difference, we may start calling our own self-abandonment peace. In this modern world, silence has become more complex than ever. With ghosting, blocking, and digital disappearance, it's easier than ever to vanish. But just because it's easy doesn't mean it's ethical. We must stop normalizing emotional vanishing. We must stop calling silence closure. Closure doesn't arise from absence. It arises from courage. The courage to say what needs to be said, to end things with dignity, to leave without leaving someone shattered in confusion. So here is a question you must sit with. If the only power you have in a relationship is your silence, do you really have a relationship or just control? This question cuts to the core, because some people do not know how to relate unless they are dominating, and silence becomes their throne. But a relationship built on fear of silence is not love. It is compliance. It is survival. And surviving is not the same as thriving. We must also talk about the cultural aspect. Many cultures value silence as respect, as humility, as reverence, and those values are beautiful. But again, intention matters. Silence that arises from wisdom is different from silence that arises from emotional repression. We must teach our children not just how to be quiet, but how to express. Not just how to listen, but how to respond. Because a generation raised on emotional silence will grow into adults who confuse withdrawal with dignity, detachment with power. Think of the people in your life who go silent when things get hard. Do they come back with clarity, with insight, with love? Or do they stay gone, leaving you to pick up the emotional pieces alone? Because silence, when followed by return, can be healing. But when silence becomes a pattern of abandonment, it becomes a form of slow emotional death. Khalil Gibran once wrote, "In the silence of the heart, God speaks." But what if the silence we hear isn't divine? What if it's the echo of generational trauma, of emotional neglect, of undeveloped communication? Then it's not God speaking, it's fear. And we must learn to tell the difference. So what is the path forward? How do we use silence consciously, wisely, compassionately? First, we must reclaim silence as a sacred space, not a weapon. Use it to reflect, but always return. Use it to pause, but never to punish. Use it to listen, but also to respond. Let your silence be a bridge, not a wall. A breath, not a blade. Second, we must teach emotional literacy. In our schools, in our families, in our friendships, teach people how to name their feelings, how to express anger without violence, how to set boundaries with words, not absence. Because silence is often the result of emotional illiteracy. And education is the antidote. Third, we must model the kind of communication we wish to receive. Even when we're hurt, especially when we're hurt, be the one who says, "I need space, but I will return." Be the one who says, "I'm not ready to talk, but I care." These small statements can transform silence from a wound into a window. And finally, we must protect our peace. When someone uses silence to manipulate you repeatedly, you must recognize it for what it is. Not self-care, not mystery, not strength, but control. And you are allowed to walk away from that, not in silence, but in truth. Not in anger, but in clarity. You owe no one your endless waiting. You owe yourself your own voice. So I leave you with one final question, and this one may change your life. If every person who ever silenced you suddenly spoke, what would they say? And more importantly, what would you say back? Would you beg for answers? Or would you finally speak the truth you've been carrying in your chest for years? Because maybe the most powerful thing you can do is not to wait for their silence to break, but to break your own. Speak, even if your voice trembles. Even if no one listens. Even if silence has been your story for years. Speak. That is how you take your power back. That is how silence becomes sacred again. That is how healing begins.